Afternoon, folks. It is the 14th of June, and I want to. This isn't. This is and probably my. This is probably the tape that I will use to upload my third and final bit of analytical observation on the first fugue from Hindemith's Ludus Tonalis. In the first one, or on the previous two, we talked about rhythm, particularly in the first one, about how the interesting points of how Hindemith uses rhythmically, both in terms of uses rhythm in the fugue, and particularly in the way that he develops, or his breaking up of motives in the second and third of the two big thirds of this piece. The next one, we talked a little bit about sequences, mostly sequences, and more aspects of rhythm. Excuse me. In the first one, we talked about the rhythmic characteristics of the subject, and what isn't really a counter, but and motives derived from that. In the first of my analyses, the second one, we talked about fragmentation of motives and how they are used, I think, really quite interestingly in particularly in the second big part of this, where modulations happen a lot, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, and this last one is more sort of, as will have more to do with like the harmonic skeleton underlay, if that's the phrase I'm after, that of the fugue of the piece as a whole. And in order to do, and what I want to talk a little bit about first is, let's remind ourselves. And again, I'm not saying anything that anything absolutely earth-shaking here, but it's worth reminding ourselves what a fugue does. A fugue usually can be thought of as sort of as more of a process than a form, but a typical fugue can essentially be thought of as having three big parts: an exposition, and then a middle section where a lot of modulations happen, and then a final section, the return of full subjects, a full statement of the subjects, and this happens in this particular one. The exposition takes place in measures 1 to 11, measures 12 to 38. You find lots of interestingly elaborations on rhythmic motives, and supporting modulations in around there, and then the return of full statements of this thing starts around like from 38 to the end. Okay, so that's what happens there, and like I said, modulation is likely, and the first modulation, particularly in a major mode fugue, is likely to be, not necessarily always, but likely to be to the dominant. Secondary modulations to the foreign keys or modes, and often with and modulations to often. So secondary modulation to foreign keys and modes happen here, and then there's a return, we said before. Okay, now I want to talk. All right, so let's go through sort of some interesting points that we noticed in this piece. Okay, the exposition of this, to really hammer home the idea of C, in measure, sorry, got the right. Yeah, there is a low octave C in measure 10 on the left hand, and so that the idea of the octaves often, in the words of Schoenberg, produce a kind of doubling effect or an emphasis effect. So right at measure 10, there's a pretty strong establishment of C in the lower octaves. Okay, and then also and then at the talking about the next thing to do would be to emphasize G, or the five of the major C. There's also a low octave G. In fact, it's the longest note. It's the longest note in the piece at the time, and this helps to set up. Yeah, is a good. And that's an emphasis on G, and I think might stand for sort of a. It's a kind of analog to establishing the key of G, like Baroque composers would do in a fugue. Okay, and it's also, like I said before, it's the first whole note in the piece. It's the first whole note, that low register G. Right. Okay. So. All right. Now, another thing I noticed is in measures, particularly in measure 21, it's interesting that there's an E flat minor triad, in measure 21, and then there's a whole bunch of and then from there on for the next little while, this E flat minor, the notes of an E flat minor, particularly E flat, G flat, and B flat, are featured in various ways. And in measure 22, to 26, this is particularly interesting because what happens is there is a. Find this here. I've got notes here, so the old man doesn't forget what he's doing too badly, anyway. And there's a G flat Mixolydian scale notes in measures 23 and 24, with F flats making. Of course, the Mixolydian mode is the major mode with the lowered seventh, and a G flat Mixolydian mode. That lowered seventh would be an F flat, and there's a prominent prominent uses of appearances of F flat, and also in here there are a lot of odd key accidentals, or odd accidentals, things that you don't find very much, like there are double flats, and there are a bunch of double flats in that particular part of the fugue, and I'm wondering whether or not those double flats are being used in a way. They're in a way to sort of like foreign notes, are they analogues to help support the idea of foreignness, right? Like the G flat Mixolydian is certainly a foreign scale to C major, and I'm wondering whether those double accidentals, like double flats, are used there to help reinforce the idea of moving to foreign keys, or like an analog to a foreign keys, or in this case a foreign mode of G flat Mixolydian. All right. Now, and then there are also a couple of interesting things here. A couple of interesting things here about augmented chords and augmented sixth chords. There is an implied Italian sixth, a fleeting sort of the notes of an Italian sixth chord in G, which of course of C rather, which of course would be F sharp, A flat, and C. Happens is I notice that's sort of interesting that happens just before this G thing here, and then this F sharp to A flat. That there's an augmented interval, augmented sixth interval, just prior to just prior to this G thing. So the F sharp and A flat, and those things, of course, are chromatic notes. Those notes are the chromatic notes above and below G. G, A flat, and G, F sharp. Those encircle the G here just before that happens. It's just, which I thought was kind of interesting. But so there's an augmented sixth there. But there are also a couple of other interesting augmented first inversion chords or augmented sixth chords in that way. Not a German sixth or an Italian sixth, etc., etc. But there are augmented chords in first inversion that happen prominently here in measure 31 on E flat augmented first inversion chord, and then there's a B flat augmented first inversion chord that happens in measure 36, which I thought was rather interesting. Okay, so and those things, and we'll talk a little bit more about where these things, how these things fit into, and how they help by reminding us of particular tones and keys at particular points that I think are rather interesting. Okay, then the octaves on G flat major. Oh yes, and then finally, what's also really interesting is that it's interesting that in measure 38, 39, 39, 41, 41, right, the downbeat of 41, there is a very, very prominent octave on F. The octave Fs, like I think it's this F and this F that comes back. The F naturals return back. And I think that the reason that does that is because what it's helping do is it's helping to suspend the feeling of G flat mixolydian, and by replacing the F natural back into the, and F natural, of course, is in the scale of the C major scale, and so I think that might be some sort of a hint that we are returning to the idea of the opening note, priority tone of C happening here, and also like the beginning, we had an octave on C's in the low range of the piano. Here at the end, from let's see, that's from like measures of 47, 48, 49, 50, and 51. There's a sustained pedal point on C and a gradual buildup of two octaves, 3 C's, three C's in a pile, making up a 2 octave span of just C natural. One bringing home again the idea of C being the home pitch of this piece. So we have, at the beginning, we have a section of this piece that establishes the idea of C-ness as being the priority tone. And in that exposing of C as a principal tone of priority, we have full statements of the subject. And at the end, we also have when this returns, when we return here, we get more full statements of the of the theme or of the subject of this piece. Back when we're moving back, we are we're establishing C again here, and we now have complete statements of the fugue subject again. Now, and in the middle, we have on. Then we move through a modulatory section that uses sequences. There are two of those. The first one is. This first one uses sequences and also Stimmtausch, and then we have a sequences of seventh chords in the second series of modulatory type activities going on, and then we have around the middle towards the middle of the three quarter area of this piece. You have emphasis. We have emphasis we have emphasis on G flat, which of course is an augmented fourth away from C, and that augmented fourth G flat, it becomes the root note or the starting pitch of G flat mixolydian with the F flat, so giving the idea of sort of a foreign or a distant modulation, if you will. So we have we have kind of the structural analogues to what happens in a tonal fugue, like the ones of Bach, Buxtehude, etc., being used, I think, quite cleverly by Hindemith in this fugue. So that's really these tonal analogues, and I'm not the first person to use that word to describe this phenomenon. I first came across it when I was reading one of Rene Leibowitz's books on theory, the composing with 12 tones, and how the 12-note row or the 12-tone style or 12-tone row can be used to create analogues to what could be done with functional tonality. So, and I think that this is a good thing for us to think about, not only as an interesting example here, but also ourselves, like in our own music. Is there a way to come up with analogues to some of the, in particular, like the form building, the form building potential? What can we use that is not necessarily tonality, but can be used in a way similar to tonality to create the analogues to what tonality does so well? Okay, so those analogues, I think, were really rather interesting. Okay, so that's sort of it for now, except for a couple of other things. This is a little bit of, and I hope you guys can see this. It's not very big. I only have the budget here at Band-Aid and Baylor Twine Productions of Hardly Hollywood Studios in beautiful downtown Bowlby is not vast, but we do what we can. And this is sort of a little. I'll hold this up. Hopefully, Larry the lamp doesn't. Larry Lampshade isn't making this too hard to read. But this is a kind of little structural, a sort of little sketch of what happens in this particular fugue. We have the exposition, and then we move from G to E flat, and the emphasis on G flat and a foreign mode, and then back to sort of an F, those F octaves here, as well as the augmented sixth chords We have an augmented 6 skeleton of an Italian 6 chord, and over here we have augmented triads in first inversion, or another way of, you can think of this as another way of, hey, that's another different kind of augmented 6th, which I think is really quite ingenious. So that's sort of a little structural map of 1 to 5 to E to the E flat minor to F. So I found that to be useful while sort of making a summary. But the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about are those chords. And this is a little, once again, I'm done with, produced with very little expense. There are those chords I was talking about. And it's interesting that we have that augmented that the interval of the augmented 6th and implied Italian 6th that happens here. And then we have an E flat minor chord, or prominent E flat minor chord, measure 21, a prominent E flat augmented first inversion chord in measure 32 and measure 36. We have that B flat augmented 6th, or first inversion augmented chord with B flat as the root. And and these notes are rather interesting because I think it's interesting that the sort of E flat to E flat is kept in between the E flat minor triad and the E flat augmented triad in first inversion. So those pitches stay the same in the area where they're emphasizing E flat minor. And then, but they're also, and over here, and then this G flat, and this note that seems to be emphasizing G flat, comes back here in measure 36, spelled again differently, and in the augmented triad as an F sharp. G flat gets respelled as B flat. No, not B flat, but G flat gets respelled as F sharp. Sorry about that, reading the wrong part of the graph. And then once again, we have this B flat is retained over here. It starts out over here in this E flat minor triad, and this shows up again here as part of the B flat augmented first inversion, or in another way of saying augmented 6th chord, and another sort of an augmented chord in 6th or first inversion. This comes back again, and these things tend to emphasize this is the 5 sharp 5 first inversion of C, or the home key, and then we have a 5 augmented first inversion chord that helps to emphasize both at the same time, depending on how you spell it, or depending on how you think of it. This is a 5 first inversion augmented triad of J, and a 5 first inversion augmented triad of E flat. So these, I find that really quite and I myself personally found that to be quite interesting. How, and the other thing is, and the notes that are left in these chords, interestingly enough, are G, B, and D, which is of course the dominant note of the root of the dominant of C, and it's a major chord on C, which I think is rather interesting. Okay, so that I think is, or at least that's what I found and think is interesting about this. And once again, the idea here, or one of the things that I'm like to sort of try to stress on in this analysis, is the idea of analog and looking for ways to construct, to generate a background, sort of a background structure, a way of creating a process that emulates the kind of modulatory and rhythmic the rhythmic activity that goes along, or development, or if that's the word we're after. I prefer actually the German term Durchführung, which means pulling through. Doesn't necessarily imply it's an elaboration of motives, and then a return to the full ideas. And we look for ways to do that. Those things that I think are good things for music to be able to do, but in a way that it doesn't necessarily sound. It doesn't necessarily have to sound like it doesn't have to sound like a. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but like it doesn't have to. You don't have to use the tonal surface in your music, so you get a different sound other than that. Something based on sort of the structural principles, but elaborated on in such a way that it's that it's not obviously tonal sounding. Okay, hopefully at least some of that will make sense. And I think that's it for now. I found this to be really quite fascinating. And there are a couple of other aspects of other fugues that I might mention in passing in another video. But this particular video is the sort of the grand finale of my observations on the C fugue in the Ludus Tonalis. I hope this has been helpful. I've certainly found it to be very helpful, and I hope other people will as well. And I will talk with you very soon about other aspects of things. Upcoming, I want to do some. As I mentioned this earlier, I want to do some work on the Liszt choral mass and connections between it, Mozart, Webern, and Palestrina. I want to work through some of the keyboard music of Edvard Grieg. That's another video that will come up reasonably soon. Some aspects of what I think are very fascinating aspects in Boulez's writing, that particularly in his piece or pieces with the title Sur un cis or Ainsi or Sur un cis, where he over time develops and reuses material. And so those are the next little few things coming up. All right, hope you're well, and that this made at least some sense. And I will talk with you soon. More fun stuff. There's that word again.